other than the fact that we get tarred with the same brush as radicals, it's wonderful to be a Muslim in Australia because Australia is the best country in the world, and we've got all the freedoms of movement, of speech, everything. You know, we don't have to have passports to go from one state to the other or anything like that. We don't have to have ID. We are treated really well by the Australian government normally, and the Australian people. So to be a Muslim in Australia, I think, is a privilege. When I was a child, the White Australia policy was there, and because Australia was supposed to be a white Christian country, and when I was a child, we stood out because of our dark skin, you know, and a lot of the Muslim migrants were treated like the Aboriginals. They only got the third of the wage of the white man. But when I was a child, I was a school child, and very, very little did I get victimised because I went to Catholic schools and I went to church schools. I only went to one government school, New Farm State School, when our house burnt down in 1953, and then I came back to Somerville House. So really speaking, I didn't suffer too much discrimination. We were such a minority in our religion that they never protested when we built the Holland Park Mosque. We had, people used to be curious about what was going on, but we had no trouble integrating. People that built the Holland Park Mosque were the labourers that came, all the labourers, like they were hawkers, and they were people cutting cane down at the Tweed, banana pickers, all of the labourers that came out, many of them jumped ship. Even Mum's father, he came from India and he jumped ship as a young man, and he was cutting cane. And they all put their money together. They never had a mortgage or anything like that. That they did a lot of labouring work on the mosque. They built it, was the most unique mosque in the world because it was a Queenslander. It was like a big Queensland house with verandas all around. It didn't have a minaret or anything like that. It was high up on the hill. It was an icon. It was a Brisbane icon, really, because we had dignitaries that came. We had the Nawab, he came out for the cricket match. One of the Nawab of, I forget the name of the town in India, but he came out to play with Don Bradman, and he wasn't supposed to come to the mosque, but the Cause family, Colin Cause and Mum's brothers and all that, snuck him out, and he came and prayed at the mosque, and they gave him a dinner and they snuck him back to the cricket club. So Mum was only a young girl when that happened, and her and her father and her brothers and the Cause family and the Rain family, they were all the first Muslim families were there. The Cause family actually were the first Afghan migrants that lived in the Holland Park area. Abdul Gayas Cause. He came to Toowoomba originally and then came down to Holland Park area, or sometimes it's Mt Gravatt and sometimes it's Holland Park. They shift the boundaries. And the Cause family, they set up they owned all that land up where the mosque was, right down to Logan Road. And before they bought it, there was another lady that owned it, and we bought the little corner where the mosque was of her. The hawkers went out into the country. Our hawkers really didn't have camels. Our hawkers had horse and carts. But the cameleers did come. Bashagul was one of them. Bashagul was often at the mosque, and he brought his camels at the back, and some of them passing through, because they had a little house on the mosque, one little room separate from the mosque, where people could stay overnight, or where they had there were a lot of because they weren't allowed to bring the women out here in the early days, they had a lot of elderly people that got sick and nobody to look after them. So they used to house them there in when they got old, and all the people coming to the mosque used to look after them. So, and they had beds there, so some of the Cameleers did stay at the mosque. And they travelled right through Queensland, right to the outback, New South Wales. But Bashagul, he was actually buried at the Mt Gravatt cemetery. He was a Cameleer. So he was one that I remember.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
1898, there were 4 brothers that came out, and only one of them stayed. They were only allowed to bring their children when they turned 16, because the women, they'd go home to look after the women in the villages. And then when the boys turned 16, they were allowed to come to Australia, because they were young, youthful workers to work in the fields and to help. The Australian government would let them come out for family reunion, but not the women. And in 1922, my grandfather came out, and he brought his cousin's son, Fazal Deen, with him. Fazal Deen ended up being my father-in-law, because I married his only son. But he came out with my father-in-law. He did Blackall, Winton, Longreach, Billawheeler. Then my grandfather ended up extending it. They had their main store at Blackall. They used to buy the goods from D&W Murray, and they were wholesalers, and Thomas Brown and Sons. Now, then they would take the goods to Blackall and use that as a base, and they'd travel to all the outback stations, and it was a very hard life in the big, because Australia was known for the tyranny existence, and we didn't have very good roads, and the poor people on the stations, they had trouble getting goods and supplies, so they used to look forward to the hawkers coming. And when they were in the outback, they had trouble getting spices and all that sort of thing for their. We had no spice shops in those days, but they used to bring it from India. And then they'd kill the meat. They'd go to a station and buy a beast and slaughter the meat according to their traditions there. And oddly enough, in one of my positions working in a clerical position, I worked for Elder Smith Goldsborough Moore, which was the biggest wool broker in Australia. And some of those old station people were our clients, and they used to come down and, because I worked in the finance department and they came for loans and all that, I used to keep them, come and sit at my desk and tell me a story while my boss was busy waiting, for them. I'd make them a cup of coffee and they'd tell me all about what it was like when the people came and how the people on the land really welcomed the hawkers, because they brought supplies for them, and how they intermingled and how they learned a little bit about their religion and how they camped out on the side of a creek or something like that. It was really interesting to listen to some of them. A lot of them would have passed away by now because I worked at Elders in the 70s, So life in the outback was very hard. My grandfather ended up opening a store in Tennant Creek because people said to him, he went to Tennant Creek because of the gold. It was a gold town. And he ended up setting up a battery that separated the tailings. And then they said, why don't you open a store? So he had the first store in Tennant Creek. And my mother ended up, my grandmother she became a bookkeeper and went up with my grandfather. They lived across the road from each other at Holland Park. So my grandmother, her family had grown up a bit, except for the two youngest, my mother and her younger brother. So my grandmother took my younger brother to Tennant Creek, my mother's mother, to work for my father's father as bookkeeper and housekeeper and all of that. Then they sent for my mother and she went up there and she ended up marrying one of Fazal Deen's sons. And it was a hard life. It was a hard life because Mum used to go to the missions to get the books. She was an avid reader. She used to go to the city mission to get the books in the library. She'd ride by horse into the city to get the books. And her and Uncle Adrian, they were real Aussies. They used to compete with each other to see who can remember the longest poems by the Australian poets, Banjo Patterson. Mum's favourite poem, she remembered it when she started to falter towards the end of her life. It was called Lost. And she'd say it was such a long poem. But Uncle Adrian, he ended up saying, I'll beat her, I'll do the Ancient Mariner. That wasn't Australian, but he did that. But it was really fun to listen to them because even at Mum's funeral, Uncle Adrian recited her favourite poem, And they had a real Aussie life. Mum's side of the family were real Aussies. Like they played the brothers played cricket in the street. They lived in Mt Gravatt area all their life. They were born at Mt Gravatt. They worked at the markets for the chap that did all the building of Mt Gravatt. What was his name now? I forget his name, but they worked in the markets. And then later, Uncle Lenny ended up working for the tax department, and when he retired there, he became the doorman at the Cricketers Club. So he had an interesting life. And then Uncle Aubrey, Mum's father, was a fruit hawker, and in the old days, we used to have people come, because we had the tyranny of distance. Mt Gravatt was out in the sticks, and so were a lot of other suburbs of Brisbane. We had people delivering milk, we had people delivering bread, we had people delivering meat, and we had people delivering fruit. So Mum's father was a fruit hawker, and when he passed away, one of his sons took that business over. It was really an interesting life, you know, over the generations to see all the changes. So our family were participating in the community, you know. So I was born in an army hospital on the 10th of August 1942. And my elder sister, Aisha, was born there too. My cousin Ahmed was born a week after me, and there were 2 baby Deens in an army hospital. And my mother had to stay in hospital because she had mastitis, and my auntie went home first, and she took me instead of my cousin. And she didn't even know she had a girl instead of a boy, and the army doctor had come and bring the baby back to mum. We stayed there until Darwin was bombed, and then the government took all the machinery for the war effort, so they couldn't operate the battery. And then they came down to Brisbane. They went into the cafe business in those days then. They had several cafes. In the beginning, we came to live in Mt Gravatt, where the fire station is on Logan Road. My father had that property. My grandfather had a fair amount of property in Mt Gravatt because he invested in property. And Mum's family lived across the road. So, and then my uncle, Adrian, Mum's youngest brother, he went to the war and fought in New Guinea. And when he came back, he had the first freehold property to build his shop on the corner of Logan and Nursery Road, Mt Gravatt, so he built a grocery store. So, really speaking, they had no trouble being Muslims, although Mum's family, because Mum's father could not speak, it was all in Arabic. Our religion was all in Arabic, and we didn't have any translations. Mum's father had trouble with English because he only had to learn it from being in the society. He never went to school here. And so he didn't teach the religion to the children. And then they married Christian women. So the Christian women brought the children up with their religion on Mum's side of the family. Whereas my father's side of the family, they didn't teach us much religion until the women came out for separation in 1949. That's one thing about the Holland Park Mosque. They used to gather there for social functions to speak their language and to interact with each other, you know. If they come from the Indian subcontinent, it might be Hindi or Punjabi or Urdu, or my father spoke Urdu and Punjabi. They had many languages in India, but they all understood each other. They had some roots that were the same, you know, and they had trouble with their clothing and everything. They used to have to get special clothing to pray and all that, but they got that from India mostly. Most of them brought it from India. My grandfather used to go back several times. Most of the men went back when they had enough money to check on the women. It was only after India and Pakistan was separated, and our family my grandfather went back to get his youngest son, who was Deen, you know, the Deen brothers of demolition fame, Sultan's father, to get him married. They had arranged weddings. Even the ones who were Australian born, if they had daughters, they tried to marry them to the existing men, and in some of those cases it wasn't really nice because some of the children were young girls that married older men, you know. But they had arranged weddings because they didn't want people. Women are not supposed to marry out of their religion. The men can. It wasn't only across India, it was across many parts of the world. It was even in Europe in the early days. It was Hindus and Greeks and But the arranged weddings, well, my grandfather went back to India to get his youngest son, Janeth Deen, married, and he got caught up in partition because their property was in the Punjab on the Indian side of the border. They owned a village, they owned a brick factory. They were quite wealthy. My grandfather was a gem collector. My grandfather wasn't a labourer. He came out with money, you know, and so he could go back and come back. So they had a very bad time because they were getting slaughtered over there. When they were young, they had arranged weddings, and most of them were married before they came to Australia. My father was married and had a son back there. My mother didn't even know because they didn't even tell them, you know. And my father came in 1936. The men came, my father and his brothers came in 1936. And Janeth Deen, the Deen brothers of demolition fame, their father was going to school here. He was young, you know. And when it was time for them to get married, they went back to the village over there and got caught up in partition, and it wasn't very nice. It was a Sikh family that hid them and helped save their lives. And then one of my father's friends was in the army, and he was on the Indian side of the border and Pakistan side of the border, and he got a truck to pick them up when they got over the border and help them settle. Sultan's eldest sister Sultana was born during partition when they were moving in the cart, under a cart.